Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm so excited to chair today. Just want to give you a bit of a background on who I am. So my name is Kate Petru. I'm based in Toronto, Canada, and I am the comms and narrative co-lead here at WEAll. So working on our press, our narratives. I work with Anna on connecting with all of our global hubs on their marketing as well. And actually, previous to this role, I was working for Green Economy Canada, where we had published a white paper on sustainable procurement with HP, where we quoted Bob Willard many times. So I'm so happy to be hosting this because Bob is a celebrity to me in so many ways. So I remember when I first saw him on the call, I think I got slightly nervous. So he really is a big celebrity, in my opinion, and definitely in this space and in Canada as well. So I'm so.
Now you're making me nervous.
It's all true. To give you a bit of his background, Bob is a leading expert on sustainability justifications, assessment frameworks, and sustainable procurement. Over the last 20 years, he's given more than 1,500 presentations, has authored 6 books, and published 2 white papers. He provides extensive free open source resources for sustainability champions. He is award-winning Certified B Corp, a sustainability excellence professional, and a Future Fit certified professional. He has a PhD in sustainability from the University of Toronto. So very well qualified to speak on this. And I think this is a really exciting topic. You know, as Tobali said, it's one of the, we have the highest registrations for WEAll Talk events. So glad that you can all be here. And if you haven't been to one of these before, the way that this works is first we've got the WEAll Talk, which will take 20 to 30 minutes. And then we're going to have a discussion. So if throughout the presentation you think there's, you know, a question that you have for Bob or for the whole group, please keep that in mind for the discussion bit. So I will pass it over to Bob to introduce himself and to give the presentation on sustainable procurement.
The reason that I'm zeroing in on net zero procurement as opposed to sustainable procurement and sustainability in general is that I think that we need to pick an issue that seems to be really top of mind for a lot of people, climate change, and use that as our entry point into transforming organizations, governments, economies on their journey towards a well-being economy. So it's really an entry point, and I think we can really exploit the heck out of that and accelerate what we're trying to do. So that's why I think it's not only the entry point, it's the linchpin. We can really exploit this. I'm going to share my slides with you. Let me just see if I can figure out how to get to the chat box. Okay, I'll do that after. I'll give you a link to the slides. So climate change. There's no way to talk about this without being a little bit depressing, but it's pretty clear that the efforts by governments at the various COP gatherings that we have experienced, including the last one, COP26 in Glasgow, was disappointing. As you can see from this graph, we're already about 1.2 degrees above where we were in pre-industrial times. We're trying to keep the limit to 1.5 degrees. And even at that, that's not good. So the experiences that we're having in the maritime provinces in Canada this year, that Pakistan has had, what's happening in the Philippines, what's happening in Florida, it's pretty clear that just where we are now, there are a lot of very significant challenges that we have. And as governments get together and they bring their pledges as to what they're going to do to reduce their contribution to the problem, and unfortunately the combined effect of the pledges that they have brought are not going to get us anywhere close to where we need to be. And in fact, even without those pledges, the current policies are way above where we need to be. It's a long way of saying that our reliance on governments to fix this for us isn't going very well. So unfortunately, a lot of businesses are sitting on the sidelines waiting for governments to do that, to fix it for them. And they can't do that. So we need to engage businesses in trying to figure out how the heck we're going to transition off fossil fuels and get ourselves into an economy that is a decarbonized economy. And one of the ways to get the attention of business is net zero. So that's what brings me to this particular approach. The fact is that most companies are really pretty lamely committed to trying to do their part on climate change. So when you take a look at the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and targets associated with those, large companies, not very aggressive targets, in fact, very few targets at all. And small and medium-sized enterprises, which make up over 98% of the companies in the world, even a more dismal situation. And in terms of actions, as opposed to targets, actions, pretty disappointing actions as well. Of course, one of the things that they can do is transition to renewable energy, and there's some efforts going on there. Also trying to be more energy efficient and get their employees to be more energy efficient as well. And just keeping track of how they're doing on energy would be a kind of a pretty good first start. So that's a long way of saying that the attention in the business community to the net zero targets as established by the Science-Based Targets Institute, which says we need to get down to 0 greenhouse gases by 2050 and reduce our greenhouse gases by 50% by 2030. The progress and the commitment by the business community so far has been not very good. So here's the encouragement that I think we can use to get them to pay attention to this. Net zero procurement. Let's suppose governments, and let's, for the sake of this discussion, assume it's national governments to start with. So let's suppose the governments of the various countries in the world decided that they wanted to implement net zero procurement. And this is the 4-part definition of what that is. Of course, we want to make sure they get best value for their money when purchasing the most climate-friendly goods and services. So develop a market for goods and services that are energy efficient, going to help us get to the point where we are not reliant on fossil fuels. From suppliers who are most committed to science-based net zero targets. That's the important part of the definition. That's the hook. Because not only does the company want to make sure it's getting best value for money and getting the most climate-friendly goods and services, they want to deal with suppliers who are on the same wavelength that they are committed to science-based net zero targets. And then they want to make that matter. And in fact, they want to do that because the buyer, the government in this case, has a purpose and strategic net zero goals itself, and it wants to deal with organizations like suppliers that are kindred spirits on this and are going to help them get there. That's what it's all about. So the pillars of net zero procurement are that the buyer themselves care about this, so it's important to them. They have a mutual accountability for what's happening in their supply chain, so it's not just within their own operations, but also within their value chain, especially their supply chain. They want to make sure that they give some credit to this and that it's a measurable product and supplier net zero criteria, not only on the product attributes, but the supplier attributes, the attributes of the company, the enterprise, the supplier. And we want to weight those criteria heavily enough to matter. Somewhere between 10 and 30% of the weight needs to be assigned to how the supplier is committed to net zero procurement. And then the buyers can help them improve in areas where they need some help as well. So those are the pillars. But the teeth, the hook, the power, the market force of this is a requirement for suppliers to commit to net zero targets and get credit for that, get preferential treatment if they are more committed than their competitors are. So I wrote a blog about this. You're welcome to take a look at this later and get some more ideas as to how this can help us achieve the system change that we're trying to do. And there's also a briefing note, and I'll put a link in the chat in a few minutes which is about this. But basically what I'm using this for is a way to try to engage government people in the procurement function as well as other functions to implement net zero procurement. So what does that mean? It means that we want all suppliers to disclose how they're doing on net zero, and we'll score them on that. We want them to give suppliers who are really committed to this preferential treatment, and we want the suppliers to be contracted as part of their contracts with the government to meet those targets. So in sort of a pre-RFP, RFP, and contract kind of wave. And the briefing note explains all of that, and it would be a good backup to this presentation. So if a supplier is asked to say how committed they are, how the heck are they going to do that? Because a lot of them are a little bit challenged to even understand the question. So we need to give them a fairly short survey, and I do have one of those. It's in Excel format right now. It's being converted to an online tool, but it gives them an opportunity to assess how they're doing on their greenhouse gas emissions, how they're doing on energy and their transition to renewable energy, how they are doing in requiring their suppliers to pay more attention to this as well, how their policies are encouraging and committing them to these kinds of actions, and whether or not they are actually helping others in their commitment to net zero as well. So there's only 8 questions in this little tool, and it's an easy way for even small and medium-sized enterprises to disclose how they're doing on things that are associated with net zero targets and what actions they're taking to make sure that they meet those targets. So what are the advantages of this? It unleashes an instant, massive market force. The buying power of governments is basically an untapped market force driving organizations towards business models that are more aligned with what you and I would think of as well-being economy objectives. So the government of Canada, for example, the federal government of Canada, acquires each year about $22 billion worth of goods and services. If we were to include in the buying power of governments in Canada, not only at the federal, but also the provincial or state level governments, as well as municipal governments, it's over $200 billion of market force. If we can get them all using net zero procurement, we will get the attention of the critical mass of businesses in Canada, as well as in some cases elsewhere, the fact that they need to be paying more attention to this and give them credit and preferential treatment if they were. It's fair, it's voluntary. If they don't want to pay any attention to this, they don't need to be suppliers to the government. It's low cost. The government's going to spend the money anyway. They're just asking them to report. The questionnaire can be used as a diagnostic. Net zero procurement is really a subset of sustainable procurement. Sustainable procurement asks about how the supplier is doing, not only on climate and energy, but also on water and waste, how they treat their employees, how they treat their communities. You get into more social kinds of things too, all of which are important. And I've been trying to get governments interested in sustainable procurement, but I'm starting to realize that maybe we need a starter set of what this is all about, starting with net zero procurement, and then we'll expand it into a more holistic set of considerations that they should be paying attention to. Opportunity here to have the federal government, for example, do this, lead by example, use it themselves, and advocate that other national governments, for example, use it at COP27 coming up in November. And also encourage other governments in their jurisdiction to adopt this by doing what I call conditional funding, which says to them, we're happy to give you your funds for whatever it is that we would normally give you funds for, but there's a little rider here. First, you need to commit to net zero procurement or you don't get the money. I think we're at the time on climate change where we need to stop dancing around and get serious about this. This is an emergency. And I think we need to be very, very aggressive on engaging businesses and other governments in this, more aggressive than we've been up until now. We're not alone. European Supply Chain Act is pretty exciting. It's based on some excellent work that was done in Germany. And the European Supply Chain Act is already talking about compelling multinational companies to safeguard human rights, which of course are vital, especially given the Rana Plaza disaster, and protect the environment throughout their supply chains. So what they're doing is they're requiring companies to have a plan to ensure that their business models and strategies are compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade at the pre-industrial levels, and that includes their suppliers. Very, very exciting. So as usual, Europe is leading the way on this. The UK also has some regulations, policies that they're paying significant attention to suppliers' commitment to achieving net zero by 2050. So again, making sure that we are working with suppliers and encouraging them to make the kinds of commitments that we need in order to be able to get climate change under control. And even the US has also got an executive order that says that the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council, and that oversees all the procurement that's happening in the US by the General Services Administration, GSA, as well as the military and so on. It's huge. But they want to require all large federal suppliers to set science-based targets and publicly disclose their greenhouse gas emissions and climate-related financial risk. So this is not some wild and crazy idea. This is already being hinted at. The neat thing about net zero sustainable procurement is that it gives the suppliers credit for stepping up to this. And in other words, it's an evaluation criteria in the bid appraisal. And it gives weight to that criteria that is significant enough to get their attention. So here's the plot. You have connections with governments in your jurisdiction. I have connections, governments in mine. We want to be able to get to where sustainable procurement is being used by all of them. So here's how we're going to do that. So we're this little group of thoughtful, committed citizens, and we need to use our levers. So this is us. And the first lever is, let's see if we can get to our governments. In my case, it's the Canadian government. You could start with a municipal government, you could start with a state government, but the government that you feel might be the most ripe for the overtures that we would make to them. So we get them engaged in it, and then we get other governments in our jurisdiction engaged in it. So my approach is to get the federal government to get with the program on this, and then cascade that through the provinces as well as into the municipalities in Canada. There are over 3,700 municipalities in Canada, and we need them all to be on board, and we can do that, and we know how to do that. Then we can get governments in other countries on board, and that's where this COP27 idea comes in, where we bring this idea to these COP meetings, where this is probably the most effective way of engaging business that has been untapped so far by any government. So businesses who are suppliers are going to be very interested in how all of this works out. So we start to get governments into it. And then we start to get not only governments, but companies, large companies can start to use this net zero procurement with their suppliers as well. So we get the big buyers starting to use this and shake down the system, make it real easy, get the tools out there, and make sure that this is very straightforward to install. We go from net zero procurement to sustainable procurement. So we enlarge the requirements so that we're looking at not only greenhouse gases and energy, but we start to look at some of the other environmental and social aspects, and we get sustainable procurement engaged in by governments and companies, and we end up with worldwide well-being economies. So it's a piece of cake. And all we have to do is just keep working those levers to make darn sure that we are taking full advantage of all of the opportunities we can to engage these various players in this. I think we can do this. And I also think we can do it fast. And that's the part that excites me the most, because we're kind of running out of runway on a lot of the opportunities to get climate change under control. So we need a sense of urgency around all of this. We need to be able to implement systems that are not going to take forever to do. And we know how to do that. and get on with using net zero procurement to save the world and get us to a well-being economy. So that's a very quick overview of what the plot is. But the opportunity here, I think, is huge. And I would be really interested in whether you can see the strategy that I'm using here as being relevant to some of the efforts that you're into in the jurisdictions that you are a part of, and talk a little bit more about how to do that. So I will put into the chat box a link to the slide decks so that you have that for your reference.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Bob.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a fantastic presentation, and I love the ending too on the pathway towards a well-being economy. And I totally agree with you. I think procurement is such a huge part of this, and it sounds like, there's been some headway in the UK and the US, and but yeah, I want to throw it back to the question you're asking the audience here on how you might be moving this forward, or how it's relevant to some of the work that you might be doing in your local regions.
Can I go?
Yes, please do that. And please introduce yourself as well. As you know, in many of these calls, we have a chance to do that at the beginning. But if you can do that as you ask your question, that would be really helpful.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a finance analyst for Logitech. I'm based in the US, and I worked in procurement for the first 3 years that I worked for Logitech as a purchasing manager for the largest department, or the largest business group of our company, the video collaboration department. And our head of procurement here looped me in on some initiatives in this realm, which very much aligned with my personal values. I've been a sustainable consumer privately for many years now, and very interested in doing more than just beyond myself. So I'm very happy to be able to make an impact at work. I'm also very happy to work for Logitech, a very sustainable minded company. Very much, we have some pretty hefty goals. We're working towards net zero carbon emissions, and even carbon positive emissions within our own supply chain. But I am really struggling to dig into our scope 3, our procurement of supplies, of services and goods from third parties, right? One of my biggest challenges so far has been, so I'm working with 2 companies that are trying to do similar assessments. And our biggest challenge has been getting vendor engagement. They don't want to take the time, it seems. They're not interested in filling out the surveys. So I haven't had any luck on figuring out why yet. I guess I just haven't talked to the right people, but in America too, we're not quite there yet. Like the Canadian government, has a high amount of procurement of goods and services, so they can drive a lot of the marketplace, right? As well as Europe. America's a little bit more of a free market, as you know, capitalistic. It's up to the businesses to do their business as they see fit. We have a lot less government regulations, and our government procurement is a lot more private. And less like public service oriented. So in our economy landscape, our free market, less government regulations for now, how do we get small businesses on mid-sized businesses to take responsibility?
Yeah, it's a great question. Great question. And I totally agree with the dynamics that you're talking about. So first of all, I am trying to make it less optional for them. This is not a request, this is a requirement.
Okay.
I think the time for requests and dancing around is past.
It's over.
If we're serious about this, we need our suppliers to be serious about it. Okay. So this is not a regulation. In fact, let me just, some of you may be aware of this, but a few years ago, Walmart sent out a questionnaire, a 15-question questionnaire to their over 100,000 suppliers all around the world, And they asked them 15 questions that
Right.
asked about how they were treating their employees, how much energy they were using, how much water they were using, how much waste they were creating, a bunch of things that you and I would consider to be sustainability kinds of questions. And some of the suppliers, understandably, were a little miffed by the fact that Walmart was
Right.
asking them this stuff. They said, "Who the heck are you to ask us these questions? You're not a government. You're a company. You can ask us about our products, the products that we're selling you, but you're asking about us as a company. It's none of your business." And Walmart said, "Hey, look, totally understand. And if you're not comfortable filling out this questionnaire, you don't need to be one of our suppliers." All of a sudden, especially the big companies like Procter and Gamble, thought this was a heck of an idea. And the following year, Procter and Gamble sent out a 12-question questionnaire to their 80,000 suppliers, basically asking them the same thing. So when you get the leverage of a market force called buying power, asking people to voluntarily fill out this questionnaire, they don't have to fill it out unless, of course, they would like to stay as a supplier.
Yeah.
So this is less optional than it used to be. And the second part is, let's give them a questionnaire that's reasonable for them to be able to complete. So Walmart's with 15 questions. The questionnaire that I put together for net zero procurement is 5 questions. The one that gives them an opportunity to talk about all of their sustainability is 20 questions. So we have tools that allow them to do that self-assessment significantly more easily than they used to be able to.
Yeah.
So all of the excuses are kind of falling away. Like, get with the damn program.
Yeah.
This is important. It's important to us, and it's important to our kids and our grandkids and so on. So let's roll up our sleeves and figure out how the heck we're going to make this happen.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Our approach so far has been, please do this. And it's an ask it and an option. So you're saying that the question needs to be posed as this is a have to.
In Europe, you can get away with the government doing regulations. In North America, not so much. In Canada is the same.
Yeah.
If you pass a regulation, this is called a mandate, and people go berserk, right? So the pushback on that is not healthy. So what we need to do is not use regulations. This is not a regulation. You don't have to do it. If you don't want to be a supplier, don't do it. So it's voluntary. And I think that strategy would work in any jurisdiction. But in Europe, they can be a little bit more forceful and say, first of all, you will report on this, 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 and this, and that's the reporting regulations. And secondly, we want to know this kind of information about your suppliers' impacts. And for whatever reason, the leadership role of governments in Europe is more accepted than it is in North America. So
yeah, right. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks for that question, and an insight into what Logitech is doing. And I love that, Bob, moving from, a request to a requirement, pushing forward the urgency that you're saying, in the presentation. We don't have time. So I've got a question here. I know, Anne, you've got your hand up, but someone here, Sashi, I'm just going to read this question out. Have they spoken to Singapore government so far? We are looking at building digital stores of what we call as net zero product lines globally and at sovereign levels. They seem most geared for changes.
No, frankly, I have enough challenge just speaking to the Canadian government, let alone governments somewhere else. So I need folks that are connected to those governments to be advocates on behalf of this particular approach. So the short answer is no. The second answer is that I'm talking about the other piece of net zero procurement or sustainable procurement. One part talks about the products the goods and services and the attributes of those. Really, really important, really important. I'm talking about the attributes as well of the supplier, of the enterprise, of the company that's producing the goods and services. So if a company is producing some really slick products, but they're using slave labor to make it happen, that's not cool. So we want to know about the attributes of the supplier, not only of their workforce, but also of, in this particular case, what they are doing to try to get themselves to net zero targets, science-based net zero targets.
Well, thank you, Bob. Sorry, Anne, you've got a question. I think you're next.
Thanks. Yeah, so some of the work that I do is looking at climate action plans here in San Diego County. And there's a little bit of movement to include, you know, procurement of what the local government is doing in that regard. But they seem pretty resistant to including scope 3 emissions because they, you know, the whole idea of the climate plan, action plan is like they've done this emissions inventory for the jurisdiction, and that doesn't even include scope 3 emissions. And so like, why bother? So I don't know if you have like a good argument for, you know, or what to do in that case when they're just like, well, we're not tracking it, so how are we going to measure it? And
Scope 3 are a nightmare. They're really, really challenging. I mean, 15 different sources. 5 of them usually apply to everybody, but still, it's a real challenge to be able to do the calculations, even with the guidance and excellent guidance that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has out there. So in the questionnaire that I put together that would require a supplier to complete how they're doing on all of these things, I'm really gentle on the scope 3. I'm in version 7 of that tool, and I've backed off a lot from what it was originally. So on scope 3, I basically asked them, which of these 15 things, 15 sources of greenhouse gases are relevant to your situation? Because usually not all 15 are relevant to every company. So they tick off, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever. Relevant and significant enough that it's worthwhile paying attention to. So they get to be that judge. And then I asked them a question, so how many of these are you tracking and starting to do calculations on? And then they get a percent score, which is what percent of the ones that are material and important and significant enough they are tracking. And that's how they get a score on greenhouse gases. So they don't have to quantify them. They just have to say how many they're paying attention to and how it's going on that. I think we have to start a little bit gently on scope 3, because if that is the #1 reason that people don't want to do this, or organizations don't want to do this, okay, let's be a little careful at the beginning on that, get the thing out there, and then we can decide whether we want to go further on the quantification of scope 3 emissions than we already are. So by the way, I use these tools on myself. I'm a sole proprietor, but trying to walk the talk on this stuff. So I do an assessment, including scope 3 and so on. And it's not as hard as some people may think. It's doable, but it's not intuitively obvious how to do the calculation. So I think we have to be reasonable in how we start to quantify them.
Thanks for that, Bob. I'm just going to read out, I know, Robin, you've got your hand up, but there's just a comment here from George I want to read out and make sure you've seen it. We are using this lever here in Scotland. We've got a link here, and the Scottish government has introduced duties and has packaged a range of tools and support into one place. However, we have major challenges on measurement of net zero and concerns about impacts on costs and small and medium enterprises. Work in progress, but policy intention and core duties are in place. Definitely needs partnership working and innovation. Oh, that's a really good point. Thanks, George.
Yeah, and this is the value of the tool, not only as an assessment tool, but as a diagnostic. It would be really helpful, I think, for governments to understand whether or not some of the challenges that one company is facing as a supplier are common to other suppliers. So the neat thing about an online version of these tools is that you can take in all of this input from your suppliers, and you start to see that, oh, they're all doing really well on these things. but there are a couple of areas where they're nowhere. And it could be an expertise issue, it could be a funding issue, it could be a technology issue. And the government can be much more focused and targeted on the kinds of support that they're going to give to the business community to be able to help them on this journey towards a decarbonized economy. So I think that the role of the government is more of a collaborator than it is a policeman in this. And they can get the diagnostic information that they need to be able to collaborate effectively by having this survey completed and finding out how the suppliers, maybe they're all struggling with something. Maybe they all score really, really poorly, which is not good. So you need to be able to help all of them in a way that doesn't show favoritism, because governments are tricky, a little uneasy about that, but helps all businesses with the issues that are in common to them.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah. I love that. More as like a collaborator versus a policeman, for sure. Yeah, and it's interesting, thinking about WEAll and our WeGo partnership and how we've got, there's a number of countries that are trying to move beyond GDP. How can that, as we see that trend happening, I think hopefully we'll get more and more governments that are measuring things, beyond economic measures and looking at procurement and saying, okay, yeah, we need to be putting these measures in place. And so sorry, I'll pass it over to Robin is next. You've got your hand up.
Thanks, and thank you, Bob, for really really setting out a strong pathway. It obviously does sound very challenging there in Canada. I'm speaking from North Wales in the UK, and similar to George, who asked the question earlier, we've been making progress on this in North Wales. We've managed, I work for a collaboration between 6 local councils, and really agree that using procurement as a lever is key. We've set some pretty ambitious targets around net zero operation for the infrastructure projects that we're building, but also a 40% reduction in embodied carbon within the construction of the 20 infrastructure projects that we're involved in. I guess one of the things that we identified, just to address the comment about costs, is that the earlier that these aspects are incorporated into the thinking of a project is key for us. So there was an infrastructure review in 2013 in the UK, and it identified that really, a very early stage of projects is a go, no-go decision. Not building anything at all will reduce significantly in the maximum emissions reduction, and the opportunity for reducing emissions then declines through to really by the point at which you're looking at fittings and kind of operational, you're looking at really only a marginal improvement in emissions reduction. The bulk of those emissions will have already been committed through the earlier procurements, the decision to build, and then the earlier procurements. So there's a lot that can be done looking at that time scale. We're just about to publish an approach we've developed with Arup, consulting company, on building it into the long-term project development timeline to try and bring this through procurement as well. But it's one of the things is around addressing costs has been, really making sure that because it's built in right from the start, that those costs can be built into the design throughout. And so when businesses are then pushing back and saying it will be an increased cost, a lot of that has already been factored in sooner. And then the other piece that has been key is has been mentioned, the engagement and opportunities for discussion to familiarise everyone through early market engagement events. And in those, we've taken an approach of really, as Bob, as you mentioned, it's really been almost a kind of an assumption to the event that, look at all these things that have already been done, and this is the kind of thing that we're expecting as standard now. And if you're talking about innovations, then you need to go even further, and making sure that we've got those case studies lined up to really demonstrate that and showcase what's already being done, so that it takes the novelty argument out of things. So yeah, just to share some of that experience, but it sounds like it's great to be all moving in the same direction. It's so critical.
That's fantastic. Wow, good for you. Good for you. The progress in North Wales is really impressive. And I think it was very appropriate that you highlight the infrastructure projects where there's a lot of attention on the embodied carbon in the cement or the steel associated with those projects, and the cost associated with all of that. And that's very, 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 very important. But to me, that's one piece of the equation that we're looking at. I'm looking at the other piece of the equation, which is the sustainability and embodied carbon, so to speak, in the supplier's organization, as opposed to the cement or the steel in the project. So it's not one or the other. We need both. And the Canadian government, to its credit, has done some amazing stuff with our National Research Council on that embodied carbon stuff and how to measure it and so on. Really, really good stuff. And they've got a net zero challenge as well going for businesses. What concerns me is there isn't the take up that we need on some of these opportunities for businesses to get help from the government. They're not interested in the help because they're not interested in making progress. And this attempt by the net zero procurement approach is to rattle their cage enough to realize that if they don't engage in trying to get themselves to net zero by 2050, they are not going to get preferential treatment by the government on the deals that they are trying to bid on, and their competitors will. So, it's a business decision. Even if they don't give a hoot about climate change, it's a business decision. And I think that's the dynamic that we need to pay more attention to. I used, in a previous life, I worked for IBM Canada, and for a while, for 2 or 3 years, I was stationed in Edmonton, Alberta, and my customer was the Alberta government. We were selling computer systems to the Alberta government from IBM. When we got an RFP from the government, the first thing we looked at was the weight assigned to each of the specifications that they were asking for in the system. Because the ones that were weighted the most were the ones that we paid the most attention to and made darn sure we were going to be able to answer better than the competitors. And we knew our competitors really well. So weighting makes a huge difference as to the investment that the supplier puts into making sure that they are better than the competitors. And at that time, this was many years ago, of course, sustainability wasn't on the radar screen for organizations the way it is now. But if we had had a 20% weight to how much we were paying attention to net zero targets, let me tell you, we would have paid a lot of attention to net zero targets. So it's a requirement from a customer that gets more attention than from us as a bunch of passionate change agents trying to make stuff happen. The customer asks, all of a sudden it's important to answer. Very, very different dynamic. And that's the one that I think we need to be smarter on exploiting as change agents and making sure that this works for everybody.
Thank you, Bob. Roland, I see you've got your hand up next. I'll pass it over to you.
No, thank you very much, Bob. Really helpful, the analysis there. And what I wanted to flag up, and by the way, I'm an applied meteorologist and climatologist, and part of my work has involved forensic investigative work. And I did produce a report some years ago on corruption in the procurement process with a very specific and well-documented example. I would be happy to share that at an individual level, and maybe Tabili or one of the others of yourselves, if I send a copy, could circulate that, because I think it's a salutary warning of just how much corruption in business can get in the way of all these fantastic things you're talking about, Bob. But my question and comment really relates to this criteria for net zero that both Rennie and George have raised. There's a friend of mine who works in the risk management sector, and increasingly in that sector, they're talking about net positive, because it's acknowledged that net zero, it has become so abused. The criteria are so inadequate. Yes, Bob, of course, you're taking it much further. That's brilliant, all in the right direction. But from a meteorologist's point of view, it's not just enough to stabilize that. We've got to be developing the mindset long term that we want to start going back below the 1.5 level if we're, or whatever peak we reach in the future. And this whole concept of net positive, what I like about it, it knits in really well with what you're saying, Bob, about taking into consideration all the second and third order consequences, but you're having to prove right down the line, as far as you think, that it's positive. So if you miss something out, not too serious then.
Yeah, I love the term net positive, and I would have used it, except that it doesn't have the currency yet that net zero does. Net zero has got a lot of currency. It's very easily understood by people. And the good news about the tool that I was referring to, which is the net zero assessment tool, it gives credit to organizations for being agents of change for positive impacts. So if their products and services are helping other organizations reduce their greenhouse gases or produce fewer greenhouse gases than before, they get credit in that tool. So there's an assessment of how they're doing on energy and procurement and greenhouse gases themselves. Plus they get bonus points for if they are doing positive things, including if they're in that kind of business, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So it's one of the few tools that actually gives credit, bonus points, for organizations that are not only reducing their own greenhouse gases, but helping others do that as well. And if they have the opportunity to do that, to extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through natural or technological means. So you're absolutely right. We need to get into that kind of thinking. But some organizations are very tempted to focus just on the positive part and not acknowledge their requirement to clean up their own act as well. That they point to this shiny object over there, which is a little thing they're doing to be to help others with their problems, but they're not doing it themselves. So it's both. It's not either or. It's both.
Yeah. No, thanks, Bob. Just a brief comeback on the corruption in procurement issue. Those of you who might read this report, bear in mind the police took no action. Their view was it is unpoliceable, this type of fraud. And I think we've got to, and that knits in with what you're saying about government can't really enforce this. It's got to be on a voluntary basis, because there is a collective in society mindset that is no longer tolerable to
good point.
look at.
Good point. Thank you.
Wow, that's wild, Roland. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind sharing the report in the chat here, I'm sure people would love to look into that. And fascinating that the police didn't find it was something they could take action on. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Were there any other questions anyone had, or anything in Bob's presentation that maybe changed your mind about something that you didn't know before, or reflections, or something in our discussion that we had that is firing you up in a company that you're working for, or maybe you're talking with some policymakers? Oh, David Curry, please go ahead.
You're still on mute, David.
I think, yeah, you're still on mute if you're speaking, David. Sorry, we can't hear you, David. I'm not sure if you meant to put your hand up, but if you do have a question, pop it into the chat here. That would be great. Anyone else? Any reflections or thoughts?
Just while we're waiting for other questions, I just wanted to clarify something that I probably wasn't clear on. This is what I've talked about is my strategy. I am in dialogue with our federal officials on all of this stuff, but I haven't I haven't finished yet. It's a work in progress. But the more I engage in this, the more I realize that what I'm trying to do is not unique to Canada. It's not unique to the situation that I find myself in. I've been advocating for more sustainable business models for about 22 years now. And my first 10 or 15 years, I was focused on what's in it for our company if it were to do that, the business case for doing that. And I'm realizing that that worked for some organizations, but really what we need are more important people, forces, asking them how it's going on these things and encouraging them and giving them credit for doing more than their competitors are on various issues. So that's why I think that tapping into customer forces, and by the way, the other market forces that I think are very, very effective are ones by banks that give sustainability linked loans, and they give preferential treatment to organizations that are ahead of the pack on sustainability, or impact investors who are looking for companies that are doing the kinds of things that they would like to put their money towards doing more of. So those kinds of providers of capital have enormous influence, as well as customers.
No, I love that. And I love what you were saying earlier too, Bob, about, when it's a mandate from a customer, I mean, that's when everyone starts to shift gears and try to adhere to what they've requested. And I love those examples of Walmart and P&G when you've got these big companies who have so many vendors. They can have such a big impact if they're doing this correctly. So I've got a question from Sashi here. He is in India, that they are in India. His question is, their question is, to draw from Bob's experience, why is he focused on engaging with governments first and not, say, larger private equity funds or primarily dealers of central banks? Because if we lay those rules at point of distribution of money, isn't that going to make a faster change?
Yeah, it would. I just don't have the connections and the ability to be able to juggle all of those plates at the same time. So I'm going to start with the governments on sustainable procurement and net zero procurement. The next one will be banks and credit unions on sustainability linked loans. And then we'll get into impact investing and ESG type investing and so on, all of which is important, but I have a tendency to spread myself too thin, and I'm really determined not to do that again. So I want to really zero in on the procurement lever, pull that one and get it going, and then work on some of the others. But you're right, it's really, really important. And if people have connections or energy or the ability to be able to influence other parts of the financial community, go for it.
Yeah.
This is not a sequential kind of thing. We need a whole bunch of things happening in parallel.
Totally agree with that. Well, I think we've got just about 2 minutes left. So I think we're going to close up unless, no problems, Ashley. Unless, Bob, you had any other further points you wanted to add.
No, I just want you to be very, very comfortable exploiting the heck out of all of the tools that are on my website. They're free. They're open source, and they're free and open source for a reason. I expect you to take them, rip them off, plagiarize like crazy, rebrand them as yours, sell them, I don't care, but use them. We don't have a whole lot of time left, and we can't afford to reinvent the wheel. So let's collaborate on this and make darn sure that we get to where we need to get to in time. And a lot of them, I've got about a dozen tools. Some of them have to do with procurement. Some of them have to do with other stuff, assessment and so on. And I really do encourage you to take full advantage of them if they're useful to you. And as we start to understand that other people are working on similar kinds of things in other jurisdictions, which to me is the huge value that WEAll helps us connect to each other, we can start to leverage our efforts in a way that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So it's fantastic.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bob. That was such an insightful presentation and discussion. I've shared the Sustainability Advantage, your URL in the link here. I'm also sharing Green Economy's Sustainable Procurement white paper. They looked at 10 different public sectors who were trying to green their procurement process. So there's a lot of insights to learn there. And as Tobly mentioned, we've got another WEAll talk coming up in October, and this is going to be about when business meets the donut. Maybe some of you are familiar with Kate Raworth's work, but I know we were talking about a lot about how businesses can have an impact here. And so I think this will be a really important talk. So thank you again so much, Bob, and thank you everyone for your time and joining this. And we hope to see you at the next WEAll talk or chatting in our WEAll network. So thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity. And anybody that wants to reconnect outside of this, feel free.
Awesome. Thank you, Bob. Thanks, everyone. Bye.